I think my mic has been muted. So, yeah, sorry. I just realized my mic was muted here, so we're going to restart. It was locally muted.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. So let me reintroduce. Derric is a lead scientist. Totally fumbled at the 1 yard line there. He's a lead scientist at the University of Minnesota, and used to work at the World Wildlife Fund. Derric reached out to me about 2 years ago almost, and please let me know in the chat if you can hear me now. And he is a board game sustainability engineer, scientist type of guy. And we talked for about an hour and a half a couple months ago on the phone. So I'm super excited to have Derric on, long story short. And also Marty, we've decided, is the head squirrel. So, okay, everybody can hear me.
Needs some title.
Yeah, it needs a title. So Derric has actually been in contact with a handful of board game publishers, some big and some small, I believe. We haven't actually talked in a couple of months about where you're at.
Yeah.
But I figured I'll let Derric let you go ahead and kind of introduce yourself and a little bit of the work that you've done and the research, and then Marty and I will probably interrupt you with questions. And I'll kind of monitor the chat as well, because I'm kind of a science dork, so that kind of stuff gets me excited. So I'll just let you get started, and then we'll jump in. We'll have a little Falcon and Winter Soldier chat maybe at the end here, but. Welcome to the channel, Derric, and thanks for joining.
No, thanks, Joel. It's been, this is like a dream come true. I feel like I'm, in the presence of greatness.
Oh, no.
To the titans in the industry in terms of.
I'm trying to lose weight.
At least you got the longevity. You've both been doing it for such a long time. It's been a part of my, education of board games. And I think, Joel, when I first reached out to you a couple years ago, it was probably around a recommendation. Possibly around Warcry and me getting ready to jump into Warhammer. Mm-hmm. And you've been pushing it so much recently then, and how much you loved it. And so I could definitely say that the plastic in this room has increased over the past couple of years, probably directly related to you. But it's been great, but it definitely ties into the sustainability conversation in board gaming. My background is... I did biology, ecology, graduate school, and started, doing work with WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, here based in Washington, D.C. And so I was a scientist there for 7 years, and I was a scientist working with WWF's private sector engagement team. So I was one of the few scientists working with others at WWF trying to engage big corporations and typically Fortune 500 companies around improving the sustainability of the products they sell, and I got to see behind the cover or behind the scenes of how those decisions are made, the different concerns that are raised, and so I left WWF a couple years ago and came back here to St. Paul, Minnesota with my family. We decided DC was a little too crazy to raise a family, and started to do that back here in St. Paul, where my wife is from. And I took on a research scientist position here at the University of Minnesota. I'm in the Department of Applied Economics and a fellow of what's called the Institute on the Environment here. But my job is kind of similar to what it was at WWF. I still engage with similar actors in terms of corporations, primarily around agricultural commodities and those supply chains. And part of my science thing is to understand what are the future impacts of different sustainability options or alternatives, and think about what are the multiple benefits, whether it's improvements in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions or improving the water quality outcomes of producing a particular item or a particular, in this case, corn or soybean or other commodity. Mm-hmm. And so, we do a lot of modeling in my lab and a lot of looking at future scenarios around different solutions. How do we design those solutions to be the most effective in terms of the environment and with that economic edge, we're also trying to think about how to do it in a cost-effective way. So it's been a lot of fun, but after engaging with Coca-Cola and PepsiCo and Targets, I started to look at this room I'm in, which is a 10 by 12 game room. It's pretty packed with probably about 300 games, and I started to think about that footprint and how I hadn't really looked at, what's sustainability in this hobby, and obviously there's a footprint in terms of the cardboard and the wood and the plastic,
right.
and what are we doing as a hobby? So that's why I kind of, set me off looking at some of the, reaching out on my own time to some of the board game publishers, and got to talk to some folks at Asmodee in Europe that are in charge of supply, Panda, and let's see, Leader Games.
Okay.
And so I got to have a few little conversations with what folks are doing, but I would say that it's sustainability around the environment is coming to our hobby. It's being driven by consumers, end customers like ourselves, but I think moreover by our hobby moving into more mainstream distribution outlets or big box stores like Walmart and Target,
right.
who are requiring those companies to do that. And so anyway, that got me interested. What's going on and what's happening.
Okay, so that's interesting. Like a Target, for example, might require Ticket to Ride or some game that's coming in there to have components and manufacturing processes that are sourced in kind of a quote unquote green manner.
Yeah, a Walmart and a Target, they've this is where a WWF, the sort of ecosystem fits in, but an NGO kind of comes over and puts a little bit of pressure on those large buyers, like and stores like a Target that has a very consumer facing entity, and start to say, you need to be, what are you doing around these issues? And,
right.
And both Target and Walmart have taken on a scorecard basically for those products coming, that they're buying to sell in their store. But it's a pretty high level, kind of cursory, not necessarily what's the impact of your board game, say, on carbon or water or those kind of things, but it's more like, what do you have in process? Are you starting to think about assessments? What are you doing to mitigate if you you have these particular impacts? But it's quite high level. But it is putting some pressure as you go into, to sell in those markets. Kickstarter also just recently introduced a new policy that every Kickstarter has to publish a environmental impact statement on their page.
Really?
So,
okay.
So that's something that, so if you're going to do a Kickstarter, you have to do it, you have to, on your page, your landing page, have a link to your environmental impact statement. So Panda Games is getting a lot of requests from, obviously, board game publishers that want to have information around, okay, what elements of my board game, in terms of the plastic, the cardboard, how are we addressing one source plastic, single source plastic, that kind of thing, that what they can put in the statement. So those are two big drivers for our hobby anyway, having Kickstarter in those big box stores.
So you mentioned, go ahead, Marty, go ahead.
I was going to say, just out of curiosity, if you talk to the publishers and stuff, I'm sure there's a lot of things that they can do to reduce their impact. But what are some low-hanging fruits that you can suggest to pretty much anybody? Say, hey, if you want to start somewhere, this is probably the easiest thing that you can do right off the bat.
In our hobby, probably the easiest thing would be the reuse, which we do a lot. And I think reusing our products, a lot of us probably can't remember the time that we threw away a board game, but we may get tired of it and sell it to someone or give it to a relative. So part of it, reducing the waste, that sort of end use of it, and that's something that gets pretty manageable. And I think our hobby is kind of, our culture kind of works that way. Our norms are, we're kind of anti-throwawayers. So I think there's a lot of reuse. I think the opportunity to try to repurpose, some of these, I'm looking at, my recent Cloud Spire, and I had to upgrade to these fancy chips. So I got like these extra chips, and what do I do with those? And so, trying to think of, what a 3-year-old can do with those chips, or trying to find other uses for them. But I think as far as consumers, I mean, it is a consumer hobby. It's the challenge between wanting a deluxeified edition, which of course has the bigger footprint, but it has all that, kind of collectability, or what we, want when we, because these are things that we're keeping, these are games we're keeping and treasuring. I think as a consumer, it's a little difficult. I think part of what our role might be is getting a little more comfortable with how the games are packaged, maybe our expectations around how a board game is packaged and what we receive. And part of that is, one of the biggest, and it's probably because it's most visible, is actually the shrink wrap on games. So that's something that, all of us have, had that shrink wrap come off. We think we threw it away and it shows up somewhere later down the line. It's something that can't be recycled. And so there's a lot of, energy to, it's kind of like the cosmetics of fruit and pesticides. The pesticides keep the fruit looking pretty, keeps the shelf life, and in a sense, shrink wrap provides all those types of benefits to our board game box and the contents in it. So there's, I would say within the publishing community, or within the manufacturing community, single source plastics have been, a big issue that they want to, or single use plastics have been a really big issue in the components of board games, or the packaging of board games. That's what they see as a low hanging fruit to address. And so they're looking at, what do they call them? They're like the little, wafer seals that you'll see on, I know, like Horrified over here, that and Rossenberger does this a lot on their Crossworld Hall. Funkoverse, when you buy them at Target, they're not in shrink. They have the little, so like Panda's trying to look at, these wafer seals, and they're getting to the point where, trying to understand, are people cutters or are they pullers? And if they're pullers, they don't want their box to get ruined. So there's a lot of some R&D that has to be done. But it's also, the expectation, I guess I come back, Marty, that our expectations in a sense with the deluxeified and the fact that we are, more and more moving towards, almost all the games are sort of a premium product, compared to back in the first days of Catan. So there's a trade-off there that I think everybody's trying to figure out how to, how can we have our cake and eat it too? But that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Well, I know, Joel. I just one last comment. I know one thing that could be done. Hey, Fantasy Flight Games, get rid of that Valley insert in all your games, and you'll. But everybody just throws away anyway.
No kidding.
Yep.
No kidding.
Yep.
I mean, that's like half a joke, but I mean, I know you're serious, but yeah, I mean, it's for sure nobody uses that thing. So before there's a couple of questions actually coming in the chat. I wanted to circle back to one before we talk about materials a little bit more. You mentioned earlier that the NGO was putting pressure on like a Target or a Walmart. Can you explain what the NGO is?
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah, a non-governmental organization.
Okay.
So a non-profit.
Okay, I see. So, nonprofit special interest groups, okay, that makes sense. And then kind of a follow-up on that was, what's your kind of experience about Amazon? Do they have any kind of, processes that they're trying to implement, or at least to publicly have they acknowledged this kind of thing? Because, I mean, they sell everything as well as like a Target or a Walmart. Is that something that they get engaged with?
Yeah, I mean, Amazon just recently, through their foundation, gave something like, $800 million out, maybe $1 billion out, and almost on average about $200 million went to, WWF got this, the Nature Conservancy, I think Environmental Defense Fund, and a couple other NGOs. And it was Amazon's, very similar to a Coca-Cola or Target or Walmart we mentioned before, or several other corporations. But, giving those donations to those big non-governmental organizations whose mission is to, improve environmental, and I think they even have donated some social outcome groups as well. That's one way a company will engage is through philanthropic, through their foundations. WWF also would work, directly with an Amazon or another company to actually look at internal decision making around where they source upstream with their commodities. In the case of Amazon, I know there's been a lot of recent engagement by NGOs to address their, moving towards an electrified fleet of delivery vehicles as a way to address, potentially address emissions and in terms of pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Amazon though in the board game hobby, they, we just talked about plastic shrink, and I guess I can mention directly, Panda mentioned that Amazon requires plastic shrink.
Really?
So they're not going to let you, so that's going to be a big hurdle if that's, your entry point.
Right.
And given, like you just said, Joel, Amazon's such a big part of our distribution for a lot of consumers that don't have local game stores or et cetera to get those games, especially today.
Well, that's an interesting comment there about the shrink wrap, because my suspicion is that Amazon wants the shrink wrap because they have such an issue with, I don't know how to say this, but the integrity of their products that come through there. I mean, there's a decent problem with board games and counterfeiting, and so anything that could be like opened and resealed in a way. I mean, not that you couldn't do it with shrink wrap, but any kind of leaning towards that end where you're like, well, they could just open it up and then retape it, and you don't know what you're going to get. So they probably have to deal with that end of it as well. That's interesting, though, that they would have that.
Yeah, and there's other. I mean, Haba has been making some very strong stances as well around shrink wrap. I still think shrink wrap is kind of a visible thing, but right now the industry, they're feeling pressure around sustainability. I mean, we saw in our hobby, around diversity and inclusion and major shifts in terms of the themes that are coming out in board games now, as well as just our community in general.
Right. Anybody
went over to Board Game Geek lately and land on the main page can tell that we're quite different as a culture, as a community than we were a couple of years ago.
Sure, for sure.
And I think sustainability around environmental and these social issues, they're feeling it. Where Panda's having webinars now to talk to, they're talking to, publishers, not consumers. So they're getting a lot of, interest. So I think it's coming down the line, but it's very nascent. It's very new. When you talk to a Panda, they're really just, they basically said if a board game publisher comes up and says, what can you give me for sustainability? Really all they can say is like, well, maybe we can do those waffle seals. Maybe we can try to optimize the punch board where we get the most out of it. Or we can, instead of shrink wrapping all the cards, that's another area where we have a lot of shrink wrapping on packs of cards. We can use these, paper buns that go around, or plastic bands, single plastic bands, and that's really all they got to offer. So it's quite nascent. Now Ludifact's quite different. They've had a history of being a little more sustainable, and of course Ludifact's another European-based manufacturer that produces a lot of
right.
That does a lot of the board game.
Yeah, just to interrupt you for a minute, in case somebody doesn't know, Panda tends to manufacture most, or if not all, the Kickstarter games, and a lot of the newer companies use them as well. They don't necessarily have to use Kickstarter, but Ludifact, they'll publish a lot of the games you find that would come out of Essen typically. Hans und Gluck and Spielworks, and I don't know, a whole bunch of those, So yeah, so I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I just want to make sure people kind of know.
No, and Ludifact, it could be because of the longevity, and they primarily on paper components, but they've been kind of ahead of the curve for a long time, offering what we would say Forest Stewardship Council certified paper products. So that means these are forests and paper mills that have been certified under FSC, or the Forest Stewardship Council, which makes sure, they're having third-party verification around the environmental practices they're taking in terms of how they're logging and the impact that's having on local communities, as well as the workers in those mills or in those forests. So that's something that Panda's not addressed at all yet, is sort of around the idea of different, more sustainable materials coming in. I mean, they actually mentioned just recently their factory in China just got 2 electric power forklifts. I can't imagine being a worker in a bunch of gas powered work inside a warehouse, but yeah, that's just some of the. So everybody's at a different stage, and I think it's at its infancy in our hobby a little bit.
Right, and you mentioned the forklifts, and there's a couple of comments in the chat here about the whole kind of, I'll just call it the pipeline, or the production pipeline is, you have the materials. So if you take Ticket to Ride, you've got the board, the cards, the plastic trains, pieces of cardboard and stuff like that. And then you've also got like the shipping container. Somebody mentioned that GMT uses this, was it soybean? Let me see if I can find it here. There's a certain kind of packing peanut that they use. And the whole like process of not just the physical components, but the actual machinery and the whole worker process and the machining process. So you mentioned shrink wrap. Well, there's the shrink wrap itself, which is plastic, but it's also like, what is the machine that's wrapping the cards or the box, and what's that running on, and that whole sort of underlying ecosystem.
Right.
And
there's like a complete life cycle analysis. You could definitely keep spinning the. I did try to draw up a life cycle assessment, or try to draw the life cycle of the board game. Mm-hmm. And once it goes from pre-production, you got play testing, and you got some very the sort of materials you're using then, but probably the big footprint is the actual production, where you're the materials coming into the system in terms of where the wood is sourced, where the paper is sourced. Our plastics are still primarily oil-based plastics. They're PVC. They have, they're tough to work with. They're in terms of an environmental health issue. They're oil-based again. And then you have the issue with microplastics throughout that entire process. And then, you have potential water impacts. When you're doing cardboard, you're using a lot of water, a lot of wastewater going out. So there's a lot of, even though our industry is pretty small, if you zoom into these individual places where they're having to produce these goods at a pretty large scale, at least relatively speaking, there can be a sizable local impact. And of course, then you have in that process of production, you have the workers in terms of human rights issues, labor issues. That's part of sustainability. And of course, once it leaves, the Panda factory, then there's the logistics of transportation. And luckily, shipping things on big container ships is pretty efficient in terms of environmental impacts. It's a pretty great way to go. And then of course, once it comes in and all the UPS trucks, and we talked about that earlier, the opportunity to mitigate those outcomes. But of course, once it comes into our home, we kind of have this embodied environmental impact at our table. It looks really great and these awesome minis.
Right.
And I think that's where, and a lot of companies keep saying like, well, Panda says, well, they kept saying it constantly, our hobby's just different. We keep our stuff. It's not disposable. We're not just getting rid of it. So really our impact isn't as bad, because we're not throwing it away. But eventually these games are going to, probably be thrown away.
Yeah, and you and I actually talked about this a little bit a couple of months ago, because that was my thing. As I was kind of playing devil's advocate, which I don't always like to do, but sometimes I got to do it. And my thing was kind of two-pronged. Was like, if you look at the stuff that we get, like you look at a Kickstarter game, and you print 3,000 copies or 10,000 copies, and theoretically, you're going to hang on to those for a while, or trade, or sell them, or give them away, or something. And so that it's not going to go into the garbage. So But you're right. Eventually, everything is going to end up in the garbage to some degree. I mean, it just is. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But if you look at, we were just talking before the show went up, like look at all the old Candyland games or the old Monopoly knockoffs. Like there's probably thousands and thousands and thousands of copies of those that have ended up in the landfill. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic there. If you, when you're looking at weighing the impact, it's like, okay, this thing has a huge impact, let's say, but we only made 10 of them, and the 10 that we made are still around and they're still being used, or at least they're sitting on a shelf, you know. So that's kind of an interesting sort of juggling act, whereas this maybe like a copy of Monopoly doesn't really have any impact component-wise, but there's a billion of them and nobody plays them.
Yeah, so I think you're definitely right. I think they're, I've engaged with Hasbro a little bit and Mattel, and these are companies, right, that, they make toys. They make a lot of, mainstream games that are often disposable, definitely have a shorter shelf life at home than our games. But they have a very, mature, it's still, there might be a little skepticism of how deeply integrated it is, but they have a very mature sustainability, team internally. Of course, they're much larger, big, in terms of what they're doing, but, they're, probably any of our board game manufacturers or publishers could go and look at, it's publicly available on Hasbro's website, but you could, you can see the writing on the wall, what Hasbro is having to leap through, in terms of sustainability issues.
Right.
And these, if you're going to, especially for Asmodee, if they're going to play in the bigger arena, and those companies, I think I bought my first Hasbro game in a long time. The other day, I got a Guess Who game from I think Hasbro makes Guess Who.
I think so.
And I was appalled at the quality of the card stock. I had to put this thing together, and it probably was trying to be more sustainable. I would say there was probably, a little more sustainable elements, but almost just, it was almost made to be thrown away, or it felt like it was, it doesn't have that heirloom. I remember Guess Who being still, pretty solid, or Candyland having really good, it never had great card stock.
Right.
But now the card stock was literally, it was a super thin punch board, and these cards are just bending as soon as I punch them out, and they're calling them cards, but they're in a punch board for Candyland. And now, granted, it's being designed for that, for a different audience, but it does raise a question of, like, you can have a more sustainably produced game. You're producing a lot of them, and then they're just getting thrown away. I don't know if those games can be recycled. Maybe some of them can. I mean, that's another part of where you say consumers or could have a role to play in our hobby would be if we did throw things away, could we recycle? Unfortunately, a lot of the components outside of the empty punch boards, there's not a lot that we recycle or can recycle in our hobby.
Well, that was kind of the next question I wanted to talk about is, if you look at any of these games, what can be recycled? So cards, I assume cardboard can be recycled, whether you're talking about the punch board or eventually if you did throw out the game, the cardboard could be recycled. I know, for example, we talked about miniatures earlier. The miniatures I get from Games Workshop, my local place says they recycle plastics, but there's so many different kinds of plastic. Now, I take the sprues, that the miniatures are sort of connected to. When I'm done snipping them out, I throw them in the recycle bin. But, I'm not super sure because, like a milk carton is one kind of plastic, shrink wrap is another. I don't know that my local, landfill or whatever is actually recycling everything that I put in there. Because I've talked to people and they said, well, we don't recycle plastics here at all. It's only like aluminum and glass, or some places don't even do glass. But
it's not as widespread.
Yeah. So it kind of depends on where you live, I guess, and what your facility is up to doing. But then didn't we share an article or something like that with? I think I shared with you. You shared with me about something, and it might have had to do with the pandemic. Was these places are actually stopped recycling plastic because of? I guess I can't remember, but you might have some more insight there.
Yeah, I mean yeah, there's been some places where recycling is becoming less common, and that there's always the issue of just the access to recycling. I think I did scour a few blogs for Warhammer around recycling their sprues, and I think the conclusive answer is that they're not recyclable,
Okay.
but or at least in mainstream, but that they did say, and I don't know if it's true. I never talked to one of their own stores, a Warhammer store, but that they will take sprues back, and they must have a process where they can recycle it. I mean, typically the challenge is that it's so much cheaper to just produce, to not, just to produce the new plastic than to invest in recycling it. This is the case with Legos. It's way cheaper to make new Legos than for them to collect, the old ones and recycle them and use them. And of course, you also lose some of the integrity of that sort of virgin plastic. So yeah, so recycling isn't so hot in our plastic. Often, a lot of the plastic, especially like resins, even if it's plant-based, some of the new resins, it still has usually another compound in it, like silica or something else that makes that process difficult.
I see. Yeah,
Yeah, so our plastics aren't so easy to recycle in our hobby.
Right. Well, I will say, half jokingly, you can recycle sprues and make terrain out of them, but you only do that so much. After a while, you don't need to do any more. Well,
there are cardboard constructables, which is a term in the industry now, that are being used instead of plastic for terrain and different things. I think the new Descent that came out utilized a lot of these cardboard constructables, which in a sense is having a game within a game. It's a little meta there. It's just trying to put those things together. But
I don't think that's actually out yet.
But yeah, that's another thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but there is actually some. If you're talking about terrain, there is some great terrain that's come out. I can think of Metromorph, which is currently sort of in between print runs, and what's the other one? There's another one there that they make cardboard terrain, which Games Workshop used to do, and yeah, it's great stuff. Especially with like the new screen printing technologies, it looks super detailed, and there's all these cool pieces of art on it. You don't have to paint it, and you can break it down super easy or super flat, and then build it up pretty quickly. So, as far as terrain go, that's pretty cool. Now you mentioned the resin on a miniature. What about like 3D? Do you know anything about 3D printing? And there's the PLA printers, and then there's the resin printers. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you don't, that's fine. I just kind of popped into my head about.
No, I know a little bit about it, and I did hear. There's been some questions about 3D printing. I mean, part of it at scale is not very. The technology still isn't there, and it's very. The time constraint. Right. How long it takes to produce 4 miniatures, that through 3D printing versus, more conventional means is pretty far, pretty big differential still. And the challenge is they still have, there's still some pretty wicked chemicals that you're using if you do 3D printing at home, and especially if you're doing resin. You're pretty. You're pretty decked out with like a hazmat sort of setup, and that's another aspect with the plastics too, is that they're always off gassing, and resin actually part of the challenge is that it has bigger because basically plastics just are breaking down over time, right? And they break down into the environment, and we hear a lot about that in terms of marine systems and oceans, and we often think of all the Coke plastic bottles washing up on an island, or the island of bottles, plastic bottles. But it's really the journey of that plastic before it gets to that island in terms of the ingestion and animals and also the byproducts of making plastic. A lot of these microplastics that are quite small. We don't even fully understand how they bioaccumulate. I forgot actually, Tony Topper.
I was just gonna bring him up.
Did highlight how much plastic might be in our bodies right now. I don't think it's equivalent to this big guy here, but when I got this big guy, this is when I knew I had a problem first, and then this is when it did make me real, and I haven't painted, Joel, but you've given me inspiration to get one day.
Well,
to get there.
Don't start on him.
But this
Just pick something smaller.
no. I've been doing other ones, but I haven't got to this one yet. But when I got this thing and took it out, and it stunk. My room smelled of this really strong plastic. Like, that's probably not healthy. And my wife could smell, and I had to like set it out in the garage to air out. But it made me think about cumulative. I mean, every box in here probably has, maybe a portion of his arm or something of plastic in it. But that's just, I sometimes wonder, like, am I silently killing myself by my hobby as I sit in this room? But that's another aspect, with the plastics, and they're getting a lot of, attention. But some of those, there is opportunities with plastics to shift to non-oil based. I haven't done the research to know if they have, less of an off-gassing potential health impact, but we call them bioplastics or plant-based plastics. And sugarcane is one of the main proponents for that. And like Lego made a commitment, at least to be, I think, 100% bioplastics in the next 10 or 15 years. And they're relying on a global certification platform called Bonsucro to have sustainable sugarcane bioplastics. So there is some, but I don't think in our hobby we can translate the plastic that goes into I don't know how useful the Lego plastic is for what we're doing in our hobby. But there is some, where people are moving that way.
Yeah, the Lego.
So I would have a conversation with Games Workshop around, or a CMON about. Come on, sorry. More about the miniature hobby and plastic.
Yeah, the Lego plastics are probably too hard. Even though the GW stuff is relatively hard compared to like a Descent or Come On, it's still pretty soft plastic. But the Lego one's probably too hard. But I was just gonna say, I think the reason that thing stinks is for theme, because it's they might have coated it with something so that it was thematically smelly. Anyway.
Yeah, it definitely smelled like death or something for sure.
Yeah.
But I know I can smell. I mean, I can smell my games. I mean, and so but it is there is definitely, I think resin miniatures are a little more dangerous than what they off gas. They're bigger particles that stick in your lung a little bit more. But again, I don't know I don't want to freak anybody out because it's not clear.
Right. I know.
Resin you need to have to be negative.
Right. I know Tony Topper, I can't remember, it was a couple of episodes ago, I think, where he said, I think we consume about 2 teaspoons annually of microplastics or something in our food. Somebody'd have to go probably listen and get that back. He says it doesn't sound like a lot, but then it says like, well, if I ate that like all at once, I don't think I would keep it down. It'd probably spit it back up or throw it back up or something. But yeah, so it's an interesting thing. But I mean, yeah, it's something that's really tough to think about and quantify when you get to that sort of microscopic level. There's a comment in the chat here that talks about sniffing the board games, and one interesting thing is you know how sometimes, and Marty can back me up on this, you get like an LCG or a TCG or something, and some of them have just like that great smell, and it must be the ink or something that they use there. And I don't know if either of you guys know anything about that, but because sometimes you open up a game and there's a certain smell that some of them have, and I wonder if that, and I happily like ingest that. I'm like, ooh, it's that one smell, and I'll just like take a deep breath of it. And I don't know, maybe I'm doing the bad thing. I shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, I'm starting to get a little bit of Tony's phobia on that, where I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be breathing this. That might be just cut off 5 years.
We used to say when we started our show, I was always addicted to open like packs of cards and smell it. We said it smells like a rainbow, and it still does.
Well, I can say that on inks, varnishes, and glues, there's a pretty strong movement towards either soy-based or water-based. So that sounds like a part of the hobby that's a better alternative that's been adopted pretty widespread now. So I don't know when they implemented more soy-based inks, but I imagine there could be a smell difference
Yeah.
when that happened.
So between that and bioplastics, we can now eat the pieces as we play.
Yeah, even though it's made out of sugar cane, I don't think I'd call it candy,
Huh.
but yeah, they're going to still be mixed with something that's probably not too great.
Right. It's not going to be 100% sugar.
Yeah, it's a derivative of that. Yeah, and I mean that it's. I think what I took from my, if I can just sort of summarize what I took from speaking to the different publishers is, and the fact the game manufacturers, and then we could take more questions, but just I think it's pretty obvious that it's new to them. The requests that they're getting to either spell out what the impact of the different gaming components or materials they use have on the environment. Those are new questions. Like a Panda was pretty upfront that they don't know the answers. They're limited on trying. They're basically have a team that's called the Green. They have like the Green Initiative or something like that. It's a inside team that's just spending part of their time. They're project managers, but they're spending part of their time on the clock trying to research alternatives, learn about alternatives, and so it's definitely a new space. I think it's going to it's only going to increase, but I think they're at a set of they're at the journey right now where I think there's they're trying to get a handle on it in terms of how to respond. And I think some of these immediate issues that are highly visible, like the plastic wrap, plastic on cards, almost everybody was much more focused on these sort of single-use plastics, these sort of things that there might be some easy things to address with, but no one's really, very few folks are sort of addressing what I would say the upstream impacts of that occur regardless whether we keep our games or throw it, which is just, really in the production, both in the materials that come in terms of the wood, the paper, the production of the cardboard, the production of the minis, and both the social and environmental impacts around that part of the industry. I think that's probably where the biggest footprint is, and it's obviously probably where the biggest costs are to try to address it. So it doesn't surprise me, that they're moving, kind of cautiously. They're seeing the low-hanging fruit. They're also seeing things that are quite visible. They're more obvious, perhaps, to address. I mean, Panda just, and it's great. I mean, I'm applauding it, but their big initiative recently is to plant a tree for every 2,000 games they produce, or every 1,000 game they produce. So they have this, plant a tree, and they're working with, tree planting organizations as a way to, I think, offset their greenhouse gas emissions. So, I see elements of, what these big Fortune 500 companies that have, much more of a history in this space. And I just see our hobby, even though it's small, I think it's going to be pressured if it needs to continue to grow. And I think Asmodee will be a bellwether for that. But there's going to be a different system a couple of years out, 3 years out, than what we see now in manufacturing. I predict. I think it's going to get a louder drum as we go along.
Well, Derric, I mean, just to take a break from the questions for a second, I just want to let you know, I really appreciate you doing this investigation and everything. It's one of those things where, I don't know, I don't speak for Marty or anybody else, but as a media person, I see a lot of discussion a lot of times on a social media or certain things like that, and I don't really know how to assess it or gauge anything, and because I'm definitely, like I said, I'm a kind of a science nerd, but I do enough other science in my day job that when I get home from work, or so theoretically, my brain doesn't really want to try to problem solve any more than it really has to, and so I really appreciate that this is your life's work, and you're turning your lens on board gaming and stuff, and I'm super happy that you agreed to come on here and talk about this and share. Yeah, I know, and
Thanks for
share
taking the time.
the what the publisher shared with you, and I'm grateful for them for having at least it's definitely one thing that they're doing some steps like you mentioned, but they're at least talking to you and allowing you to ask them questions, which is a good first step all by itself, really. But yeah, so I just wanted to say thanks for that. Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it's just, I think it was interesting. I was thinking about this, about how the video game market and board game market are doing the inverse of each other. So video games, remember, used to come in plastic cartridges with boxes and manuals. And then over the years, they went, the manuals were gone to CDs, to digital distribution, to where the video game industry impact is getting less and less. But as board games grow, just because of the nature of what the hobby is, it's going to have a bigger impact than what video games do. And there's not really a correlation. It's like, well, they can go the path of what video games did, because you can't do, like, okay, you can do digital board games, but you know what I mean. It's like just interesting. Those two industries have like crossed each other.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because you have here like cloud gaming kind of around the corner. So there won't be any media. You won't even need quote unquote physical disk space locally. It'll be in the cloud somewhere. Granted, there'll probably be millions of servers making some kind of impact, but the board game industry, as I think Derric kind of mentioned earlier, and I think we'd probably agree, is leaning more towards the heirloom collector's item product that takes up, the individual game takes up even more of a footprint than it did before. So it is really leaning towards the other side with all these Kickstarters and everything.
Yeah, I will say on the positive that I think, at least, a lot of my work is looking at raw materials and commodities and the opportunities to improve the environmental outcomes of those and social outcomes, and still produce things from those goods. I think there's definitely an opportunity for us to still get a deluxeified game that has a reduced footprint. It's not zero, but we can reduce it. I think part of it is going to take some courageous actors that have both, it probably is potentially an Asmodee or someone that has the financial space to take that jump and kind of lean into that. I mean, they do have some some of their publishers use 100% recycled paper. I think I forget which there's like a publisher or like a game brand under Asmodee. There's so many of them, but I think it's called something Green Games, but it has green in the title. In all of their products, they use 100% recycled paper. But I think there's an opportunity for the industry to learn, and we can definitely minimize our footprint. I guess I don't want us to feel like just because we have deluxeified games and all these components that we should kind of ignore trying to do something. I think we can keep calling out and requesting, like, okay, it's great we got plastic, it's great we got paper. We still want those things, but how can we start getting them produced smarter? How are you going to do that in a way? What incentives do we need? And I think the challenge will be these are we're trying to internalize externalities in the marketplace whenever you're addressing sustainability, and there's always that issue of cost. But it's something I'm just saying I think we have an opportunity to have a significant impact in our hobby, and I think sustainability is something hopefully it doesn't get marginalized in our hobby, because I think we could do a lot.
One thing that occurs to me as you mentioned that is, like you mentioned, Asmodee has this company that kind of focuses on the recyclable components. Is there the possibility to hit kind of the economy of scale? Because right now, production and board games and miniature games and everything kind of has a habit, right? So when we do a game, we have cubes, or we have certain cards, or certain types of plastic, and certain types of other production processes. But over time, is it possible, because it's harder and it's probably more expensive to use recyclables, but if we sort of collectively as an industry that sort of spun up our wheels and that became more commonplace, wouldn't the cost of that sort of style of production and the use of those components and everything start to come down as we start to hit like an economy of scale?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think the evergreen titles are where we should put our emphasis.
Okay.
Try to emphasize. Those titles that are selling 20, 50. They're having 65,000 print runs. A Ticket to Ride. If we could actually, threw that out the day the person I was talking to, I said, what if you guys took Ticket to Ride, just one of your games, this big game, and said, okay, we're going to see if we can make it. Going to call it a sustainable. Maybe we team up with WWF or someone else, do some branding, get some benefits there, maybe Target, making it exclusive, hype the sustainability side, but actually really, focus on one product. I mean, they already have the cutting edge with Ticket to Ride. It's produced by Ludifact, all the cardboard. They do send in, all the trains come from China, but, Ludifact currently has two lines of publishing, of manufacturing. They have sort of conventional paper, and then they have their certified, more sustainable paper. But I think those evergreen titles, to your point, and we could learn a lot, given the scale that those are being produced at. Those would be a first idea of a place to start to test. Again, it puts a lot of that in Asmodee's court, which I'm not.
Yeah.
We can say whether we're comfortable having it led by one.
Right.
One
Yeah.
company,
So
but
somebody would
great
probably
point.
have to sort of be the guinea pig, right, to make that first leap with what you said, like a large scale production, like a Ticket to Ride or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and the sweet in the pot would be to have. I mean, most of these companies that engage in sustainability initiatives and come to a WWF or begin to move towards this direction, it's really because it's not so much, when we think about risk across the company, there is the nuts and bolts of like buying the input, buying the wood and then producing your game and, looking at making sure you're in the, black in terms of that. But there's also other factors that come into play, and reputational risk is the biggest one around sustainability. It's the short, the license to operate, and those sort of intangibles around those risks in terms of either future legal risks and where you're sourcing, the reputational risk in terms of who's going to buy it or not buy it, which markets you have access to. Those are real costs too, even though they aren't the same as, oh, if I get a sustainable, and it becomes the calculation. It's like, oh, maybe it costs an extra so much to get more sustainable, to produce a sustainable game, but you may see this, other benefit on the other side, and in terms of your overall picture. So I think companies are looking at it quite sophisticatedly across. And I think if an Asmodee did partner with this is why you come to a big NGO that has a conservation brand, and you got Target. I could see a match made in heaven with a lot of players seeing it, getting excited.
Yeah, I mean, there's
about
a certain.
So
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a marketing angle there, and I mean, I feel like I would say, well, heck, I'd buy a copy of Ticket to Ride if they did something like that, just because. There's a comment or a question in the chat here from Philip, and I think I want to kind of bring it in because it ties in with this. And he says, what percentage of evergreens make up the sales market? My understanding is that most of the sales market is the evergreens, because you have your Ticket to Ride, your Terraforming Mars, your Catans, Magic the Gathering, all of the big hitters. And Marty, I mean, you follow this, I think, a little bit more than I do, but that's my understanding is the vast majority of games sold actually are those evergreens. But I don't know for sure. I mean, I'm kind of hazily picking out a statistic there.
I couldn't quantify that at all, so I'm not sure.
I think I've heard Bonacor and others state that, the evergreen allows you to produce your other games, basically. I mean, a lot of times it flips capital to do those other games and experiment. But if you just look at all the acquisitions that Asmodee has made, they're going after an evergreen, not the publisher.
Right.
And you can look at even when they peeled off, when Kobe Docs peeled off with Flat Hat Games, he wasn't able to keep those he's rebooting Summoner Wars, but
yeah, he
he
did.
also has
Yeah,
those
absolutely.
evergreens.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I think it must have been maybe a Board Game Insider podcast or something where I have recently heard that, like you sell 50,000, 100,000 copies or whatever of Terraforming Mars, so you can print 20,000 of your other 8 games. But I don't know holistically if you look at the whole industry, because there's got to be 1,000 board game publishers. If you add it all up across the board like that, how it would look. My suspicion is, and maybe somebody watching this later or something might come in and comment. My suspicion is it's got to be largely evergreens, but I'm not 100% sure. That's a good question.
Well, I mean, I know that I keep up with. There's a website called ICV2 that does their quarterly charts of what sold well in the past quarter, and when it comes to board games, the same ones are there. 6 or 7 of the 10s always Ticket to Ride and Catan. Now it's Terraforming Mars, Wingspan. They're always there in the top 10. So I bet if you sum all those up together, it's got to be double digit, market, I would think.
Yeah, easily. Yeah, and so.
Yeah, they almost become like high paying rental property that you can just maintain, and it allows you to go off and do your other stuff too. Do new things. But it keeps you liquid absolutely. A little bit. But yeah, I think that's really a great point, Joel. I think that's an opportunity to see if we can find some new solutions. And like you said, with Panda seems, they're doing a lot of the major Kickstarters. That's where we're starting to see. I don't know how we think of Kickstarters in the way of evergreens. I guess over time they don't raise as much money, but still a pretty big, I don't know the number of units. What's the largest number of units that a Kickstarter? Would that be Gloomhaven?
Exploding Kittens.
Or no, Kittens. Exploding Kittens.
Exploding Kittens was a ton, but yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
What was the total?
I would have to get on my phone and look that up.
Okay. I just know a Ticket to Ride when they were telling me that their print runs that they put in and they stagger them, and why he was saying it was so difficult to, you're trying to get all these pieces to come together, and you have a system that's already up and running, and to bring more sustainable principles in, it's difficult. It's like trying to jump on a ship that's moving. But yeah, it was like $70,000. It was 70,000 units, I think, is what he was saying is like our print run, our new print run for.
And Exploding Kittens in 2015 had 219,000 backers.
Wow. Okay.
And it's still, and that's a Kickstarter that still is in production. So they're not doing Kickstarters, but they're still producing that game, and
Right.
And it's become an evergreen for other titles. I mean
yeah, I think it's my suspicion is that the number of evergreens to come out of Kickstarter is probably equal to the number of evergreens to come out of not Kickstarter. I have no basis in reality of that, but I did a study of like the own games that I've reviewed and stuff coming out of Kickstarter versus not over the years, and
that sounds real scientific, Joel.
You should get on that one right there. That's probably up your alley. But that would be interesting. How many evergreens since Kickstarter started? What's the ratio of an evergreen started from Kickstarter versus
that'd be tough because Kickstarter hasn't been around as long. I'd probably have to start around like 2012 or 13 or 14 or something, and then go from there.
You can control it for the same period.
But the only reason I say that is my little sort of guesstimate there is because a while ago I went back. I actually did this twice since I started reviewing games, because people used to say, "Oh, so many crap games come out of Kickstarter versus the real world," and I went through and kind of looked at all the games that I had I'd seen that were Kickstarters versus others that weren't, and it was about the same percentage of games I thought were, in my opinion, good games versus bad games. And I would say it was about 25% of them were I would call bad, and where 75% of them were at least good. Maybe they weren't the greatest thing in the world, but and it seemed to match up to me across the board. So to me, I was trying to figure out if there was a myth that Kickstarter games were somehow significantly worse than non-Kickstarter games, and just with my own personal assessment, which is completely subjective, of course, they seem to be about the same. So yeah.
Well, especially not now when you're talking about a lot of larger publishers are going to Kickstarter with what you feel would have been a very good game anyway. Prime example, Portal Games just took Robinson Crusoe, who did amazing, they probably didn't have to go. It was GameFound instead of Kickstarter, but they probably didn't have to go that route. So you got a lot of companies. It's like, this is probably going to be a big hit, and we're really going to, punch it up by putting it on Kickstarter GameFound so that more eyes can even see it.
Do you guys think we're hitting like I feel like Hollywood and the film industry has kind of hit this. We're getting reprints. You're seeing old titles get remade, and there's not as much new stuff. And I mean, like Disney's constantly now taking all their animated and creating new. Do we see that in board game now, where we're just like, as it becomes we just got to recreate the same game? And I mean, Robinson Crusoe is one example, but where we're just seeing every year it's going to be these new, I guess the second edition or the third edition. But I feel like that's becoming much more lucrative than it was in the past.
Well, it's a low risk. In the episode that we just released, we covered three. I didn't realize at the time, but we covered three re-releases: Spartacus, which came out like 2012 or whenever that was, Ashes, and Summoner Wars. So those games we just covered, all three have been just re-released.
And pretty soon it's going to be Sentinels of the Multiverse is.
I think the frequency of new editions is increasing. Again, that's anecdotal, but I've heard that sentiment sort of bandied about over the last year or two. It seems like the second edition, the deluxe edition, the whatever is increasing. I mean, I just reviewed a game After the Empire. I think I put the review out last week, and they released on GameFound this week. I actually had the review in the can, and I reached out to the publisher. I says, "Hey, I've got this, but I try to stagger my release schedule." And I said, "Oh, I'm doing this show here that we're on right now." And they said, "Why don't you put it out on Friday, because we're going on GameFound?" I'm like, "Oh, really?" And then, so I looked, and they're doing this really cool deluxe edition. And I was like, "Wow, I wish I had that one." But but that game just came out. After the Empire just came out. Like, yeah.
But I'm going to say I have no issue with that. I mean, it's not like you talked about Hollywood. Hollywood's different, where they're not taking the original and touching it up. Lots of times they're taking a story and redoing it with different people. That's different. But all three that I just talked about maybe were redone and tweaked a little bit. But I don't mind it, because there's a lot of games in the past I never got to play. Like last year, I never played Tammany Hall. And a new version came out of that last year. It's like, wow, man, I did miss this good game. I've experienced a lot of games over the years that I just missed, and they were hard to get. Another one that was just announced from Gale Force and I, Tyrants of the Underdark. It's one of those, I loved it when it came out, then it kind of went away, and they're bringing it back. So there's a lot of new people in the hobby, but I think it is a little bit different than Hollywood, where it's just taking an idea and an old idea and just, the Ghostbusters 2 or hey, we're going to do Ferris Bueller's Day Off, except with brand new actors and everything. It's like, no, please don't. But that's
I agree with that. Yeah, and I wasn't trying to. Yeah, that was a bad. And I mean, the reissue part was but I do think the reissues in the board game hobby, either it's a title that's not widely available, or it's got high scale prices, and so it's out of print, and if they do bring it back, that's totally fine. That makes a lot of sense. And they're often been tweaked and improved. I wonder if it is.
I think there's a kernel of a point there, because, like you said, anybody can go back and watch Ferris Bueller. Like, there's no print run on that, because it's a movie. Whereas, Marty, you're right. So if you miss Tammany Hall, or you miss a game and it's not in print, well, you're not going to be able to get after it. So just having a new print run or a new edition isn't necessarily like rehashing an old idea. It's just like, hey, this was a great idea. We need to get it to more people. Tammany Hall is a fantastic example. That a game, I think when it came out, it had less than 500 copies in the initial run, and then they reprinted it back in 2012, a little bit more, and now they reprinted it again, and it's definitely a unique game. And I was sad to see that Z-Man, as well as Grail Games, have both decided not to reprint a bunch of the Reiner Knizia classics that they have. So I assume that those licenses will lapse, and those a lot of those are, in my opinion, great games. But the reason I'm sort of dovetailing off of this is because I wonder if part of the sustainability issue in the hobby is that whole scattershot, let's print a billion different games. I mean, Stephen Bonacore came up earlier. He's been pretty vocal about this, where if you roll back 5 years or so, the strategy of the Evergreen, called the Evergreen strategy, was to print 20 games and hope one of them was an Evergreen. That would help cover the cost of the others that didn't do so hot. And then that one would go into your pipeline. You'd have an Evergreen, in perpetuity. And they keep doing that every year, 20 games, 20 games, 20 games. So that creates a lot of waste in a lot of different ways, if you want to look at it that way. Although there should be some other good games in there to enjoy. But I wonder if a shift in the hobby to focusing on, I hate even saying this out loud because I hate stifling creativity, but if there could be a focus more on, like, let's just print the really good stuff. I don't know if that would sort of help the environmental footprint. It would help, reviewers' sanity, because there wouldn't be a million games coming out every year. There would only be yeah. But,
yeah, I think the million games coming out makes it hard too. I mean, there's such good games that come out that, I mean, it's hard to get that evergreen or be that title. And I think the scattershot, everybody's doing that. And like you said, there's 1,000 publishers. And so, I don't know, what is there, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 games a year that come out. And they can be really decent games. I mean, how many games have you probably reviewed in your podcast that, the month later you're like, that game was good, but no one's talking about it. Right? Like one. And so, I mean, the publishers probably feel that as well. And it's like, I got this brand sitting here that, I can make it better. I can, gussy it up, and I know it's got an audience, just like an expansion. But now it's expansions of the base game. I mean, these reissues, I don't know if they're more common than they have been, but it makes total sense to me if I had one of those in my portfolio. And I think that's kind of what Sentinels, mentioned, like, this is where we wanted to walk away, but it's where we're making our money,
or if not re-releases, obviously FFG is really good at making new editions. Arkham Horror has been around for decades, and now they're on the third edition. So you take something that's very popular, has been evergreen, tweak it, new edition, put it out. So it's not a total re-release, but
you have evergreen rule books or evergreen mechanics, I think, like with the zombie sides or with all the dungeon crawls, in a sense, have become, that's been used across platforms, but definitely, Imperial Assault, Lord of the Rings. I don't know how many Journeys in the Lord. I have a bunch of, FFG. I live right next to FFG actually, but I got a bunch of their, basically the same mechanics but tweaked, but it's pretty subtle. And I don't know if I think that's bad. I mean, if I really like that game and I want to have a slightly different theme on it, or it's still just as fun.
Okay, well, this has been a great talk. Derric, like I said earlier, I really appreciate you coming on, and Marty as well. It's been definitely educational for me. We're getting a lot of good feedback here in the chat, which is nice. I appreciate everybody in the chat as well coming on and giving your questions and your feedback. It's kind of
thank you.
it's kind of a off the beaten path here for for the channel, and I think in general. But so anyway, I appreciate everybody involved, and like I said, I'm a science dork, and this kind of stuff is just interesting to talk about and just think about. And maybe maybe if somebody gets a hold of this at Asmodee or Days of Wonder, whoever, and they can think critically about maybe making a shift, like you said, or some kind of leap, or maybe something we haven't even covered here or thought about. I'm curious about that and how feasible
it'll be
is.
A bottom up.
Yeah,
it'll be a bottom up movement. I mean, us as consumers, and then I think those immediate the retailers as well are going to have a pretty big play. But
right. Those NGOs and working with Target, like you mentioned at the very beginning, I think could be a big driving force. And I think just to kind of maybe try to put a pin in that is like, I mean, cause I'm just kind of imagining the sort of messaging and the marketing impact and just the after effects if they came out and said, hey, guess what? Ticket to Ride starting in 2023 or something is going to be a green game or something. I hate that word, but it's.
Do you think we could use Lego plastic for the trains? Those trains are pretty hard.
Sure.
Or we could get Lego. They could get Lego to make the train, so they could be little Lego bricks.
Yeah, and they could hook together or something. There could be some.
get to ride with Lego trains.
Buildable
The little
component there.
Lego block.
Yeah.
Yeah. Asmodee, ring me up.
So,
Hey, guys. Well, I really appreciate
yeah.
you guys as well. I just think I want to say it's just, yeah, I listened to both of you. I've been in the hobby for like 15 years, but since you guys both came on the scene, and it's just been, you guys put out quality content. I don't know how you do it constantly, and
Well, thanks, Derric.
Marty and Tony, the humor. I mean, gosh, I almost want to go out and buy a lawnmower. Tell Tony.
It's getting to be spring up there, right? You got to mow the grass.
I don't have much of a yard, but he's got me. Yeah, I love it. But it makes me think of moon pies every time I grew up with moon pies and RC colas in Kentucky, and so that's where it's at. Anyway, appreciate you guys. This is awesome.
Thanks, Derric.
Listen to you guys.
You guys will not believe what I'm going to do right after I get done with this. I'm going to go mow my lawn.
Yeah.
Seriously.
All right. Have fun.
Yeah, thanks. But we did mention that we might talk a little bit of Falcon and Winter Soldier. But Derric is not caught up. So I want to be careful about spoiling. I know Marty and I, we caught up to the latest episode here, just to kind of epilogue this show here with Falcon and Winter Soldier.
Well, maybe what we do is wait till after the finale on Friday, then have a full discussion.
Well, there you go. We should do that. Why not? Okay, I would be. Let's do that. Let's just wait for that, and then we can corner out a little bit of time. I will say that I have been going back and watching all of the old MCU movies, and the way they put that stuff together, like when I watched the first Avenger, the first Captain America movie, I mean, I got like slightly verklempt because I was like, oh my gosh, look at this kernel that they carried all the way through, even into Falcon and Winter Soldier, across the Infinity War and all that stuff. And I'm like, these guys are just talk about the long haul. Yeah. Anyway, it's good stuff. I'm into that. Okay, guys. Enough geeking out. So anyway, thanks everybody for jumping on, and thanks everybody for watching, and thanks again, Derric. So have a good day, and definitely reach out to publishers if you can, and just express your thoughts there. But thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Yeah.